Analysis of a Bible book. Welcome. Today, we're going to walk through one of the most important academic skills you will develop in biblical studies, writing a rigorous, well-structured analysis of a Bible book. Now, I want to be clear about what we mean by analysis. We are not talking about a devotional reflection, a sermon outline, or a simple summary of what happens in a book. We are talking about a scholarly exegetical analysis, a systematic, methodologically grounded examination of a biblical text that engages its historical setting, its literary construction, its theological message, and its interpretive history. This kind of writing requires you to think on multiple levels at once. What does the text say? What did it mean in its original context? How has it been interpreted? What is its theological and literary significance? Whether you're writing a 10-page undergraduate paper or a 60-page graduate thesis, the same foundational disciplines apply. The scope changes, the depth changes, but the method remains consistent. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Choosing your book and defining your scope. 2. Gathering your tools, primary sources and secondary literature. 3. Historical critical context. 4. Literary and structural analysis. 5. Exegetical analysis of key passages. 6. Theological themes and motifs. 7. The history of interpretation. 8. Structuring and writing your analysis. 9. Citation, documentation, and academic integrity. 10. Common mistakes and how to avoid them. Let's begin. The first thing you must do before you write a single sentence is make a decision about scope. This is more important than most students realize. A Bible book is not a short document. Even a shorter epistle like Galatians contains 6 chapters dense with theological argument, historical allusion, and rhetorical strategy. A book like Isaiah spans 66 chapters, 2 or 3 distinct historical periods, and has generated thousands of pages of scholarly debate. Ezekiel, Job, Psalms, these are vast literary worlds. So your first task is to ask, what is the actual scope of my analysis? There are 3 levels at which you might be working. Level 1, the whole book overview. You are providing a comprehensive introduction to the book, its background, structure, major themes, and theological contribution. This is appropriate for an introductory course assignment or a general academic essay. Level 2, a focused thematic or theological study within a book. You have selected one major theme, say covenant in Deuteronomy or resurrection in 1 Corinthians or lament in Psalms, and you are tracing that theme through the book with exegetical precision. Level 3, a deep passage-level exegesis within a book's framework. You are analyzing one or more specific passages in depth, but your analysis is grounded in your understanding of the whole book. This is typical for a graduate exegesis paper. Know which level your assignment requires, and do not drift between them without intentionality. Slide. The 3 levels of scope with visual diagram. Once you have identified your scope, write what I call a guiding research question. This is a single sentence that focuses your entire analysis. For example, what is the theological function of the covenant lawsuit structure in the book of Amos? How does Paul's use of the Abraham narrative in Galatians 3-4 serve his argument against the Judaizers? What does the book of Job reveal about the limits of the retribution principle? Notice what these questions do. They are specific, they are arguable, and they require sustained engagement with the text. They are not simply descriptive, they are analytical. Write your research question down before you do anything else. Tape it to your desk. Every section of your paper should be answering it. Biblical scholarship operates within a defined set of tools. You need to know what they are and how to use them. Primary sources. Your primary source is, of course, the biblical text itself. But which text? This question matters. If you are working on an Old Testament book, your primary text is the Hebrew Bible, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or the newer Biblia Hebraica Quinta. If you do not read biblical Hebrew, You will work with the best available translations and engage with Hebrew terms through lexical tools. For the New Testament, your primary text is the Greek New Testament, NA 28 or UBS 5. You should also consult major translations, NASB, ESV, NRSV, NIV, and note where they diverge because translation differences often reveal interpretive decisions that are themselves exegetically significant. For the Old Testament, the Septuagint, LXX, is an important secondary primary source, particularly for understanding how Second Temple Jewish communities read the Hebrew text. Secondary literature, categories you must engage. Think of secondary literature in 4 tiers. Tier 1, reference works, biblical dictionaries and encyclopedias. Anchor, Yale Bible Dictionary, ABD, Dictionary of the Old/New Testament, IVP series, New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, lexicons, BDB or Halat for Hebrew, BDAG for Greek, Bible atlases and archaeological resources. These are essential for historical, geographical background, Tier 2. Commentaries. Commentaries are your closest scholarly companions. You should consult at least 3 types. Critical/technical commentaries, ICC, Hermeneia, Word Biblical Commentary, NICNT/NICOT, highly technical, engage Hebrew/Greek, interact with textual criticism, exegetical commentaries, NACBECNT, NIGTC, solid exegesis, balanced depth, theological commentaries, TOTC, BST, useful for theological synthesis. Do not read only one commentary. Commentaries reflect their author's presuppositions. Compare them, disagree with them. That is good scholarship. Tier 3, monographs and journal articles. Look for book-length studies on your specific topic and peer-reviewed articles from journals like Journal of Biblical Literature, JBL, Vetus Testamentum or Novum Testamentum, Catholic Biblical Quarterly, CBQ, Bulletin for Biblical Research, BBR, Tyndale Bulletin Used Databases, JSTOR, ATL, A Religion, EBSCO, Host Academic Search. Tier 4, Popular and Devotional Works. These have their place, but do not cite them in an academic analysis. Know the difference. A word on sources always trace claims back to their origin. Do not cite a commentary citing another scholar without verifying the original source. Secondary citation is acceptable only when the original is genuinely inaccessible. Every biblical book was written by someone, somewhere at some time for some community. Your analysis must account for all 4 of those realities. This is the domain of historical criticism, and it encompasses several sub-disciplines. 1. Authorship and dating. Who wrote this book? When? These seem like simple questions, but in biblical studies they are rarely simple. Some books have clear authorial attribution. Paul identifies himself in Galatians 1:1. Others are anonymous. The book of Hebrews names no author, and the scholarly debate over its authorship has lasted 2,000 years. Still others present pseudonymous or complex authorship questions. Was Daniel written in the 6th century BC or the 2nd? Did one author write all of Isaiah or 2 or 3? These are not peripheral questions. They directly affect how you interpret the text's message. Your job is not necessarily to solve these debates, but to acknowledge them honestly, engage the major positions, and articulate which view your analysis proceeds from and why. For example, this analysis proceeds from the assumption of Pauline authorship of the pastoral epistles, while acknowledging the significant critical scholarship that attributes them to a Pauline school. That is academically responsible. 2. Historical setting and occasion. Ask, what was happening historically when this book was written? What prompted its composition? What crisis, need, or occasioned the writing? What was the socio-political environment? What was the religious landscape? For a letter like 1 Corinthians, the occasion is recoverable in remarkable detail. Paul is responding to reports and questions from a divided, ethically compromised congregation in a Roman port city dominated by patron-client culture, mystery religion, and Greco-Roman rhetoric. Every chapter makes more sense in that light. For a prophetic book like Amos, understanding the economic prosperity and religious complacency of Jeroboam II's Israel and the social stratification it produced is not background noise. It is the ground in which the entire message is rooted. 3. Original audience and purpose distinguish between primary audience, who first received this text, and secondary audience, who it was later addressed to or preserved for. Ask what the author was trying to accomplish. Was the purpose paranetic, moral exhortation, apologetic, defending a theological position, polemical, arguing against a competing view, liturgical, eschatological? 4. Canonical and intertestamental context. Where does this book sit within the biblical canon? How does it relate to earlier or later books? How does it participate in the larger biblical narrative? For New Testament books especially, you must understand the Second Temple Jewish background, the intertestamental period, the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Qumran scrolls, Philo, Josephus. These are not marginal sources. They are the water Jesus and Paul and John swam in. The Bible is not a theological dictionary, it is literature. And to understand its theology, you must first understand its literary architecture, genre identification. The first literary question is always, what kind of text is this? The biblical library contains historical narrative, Genesis, Samuel, Acts, Law/Torah, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, poetry, Psalms, Song of Songs, Lamentations, wisdom literature, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, prophecy, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, apocalyptic, Daniel, Revelation, portions of Zechariah, gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in a unique genre, epistle/letter, Pauline, general epistles, apocalyptic epistle, Revelation is both. Genre is not a surface-level categorization. Genre controls meaning. A lament psalm is not making propositional truth claims the way a legal code is. An apocalyptic vision uses symbolic, hyperbolic language that should not be read with the same literalism as historical narrative. Misidentifying genre is one of the most common and consequential errors in biblical interpretation. Structural analysis. Once you have identified the genre, map the structure of the book. Ask, how is the book organized? What are its major sections? Are there structural markers, the introductory formulas, repeated refrains, chiasms, inclusios? Does the structure itself communicate theological meaning? For example, Amos opens with a series of oracles against surrounding nations before turning the accusation inward toward Israel. That structural movement, from look at them to now look at you, is itself a rhetorical trap. Understanding it changes how you read every oracle. The book of Matthew is organized around 5 great discourses, a structure that many scholars believe is deliberately Mosaic, a new Torah for a new Israel. Recognizing that structural intention is exegetically essential rhetorical and narrative analysis. If you are working with a letter, identify the rhetorical structure, exordium, narratio, propositio, probatio, peroratio. Paul was trained in Greco-Roman rhetoric, and his letters follow recognizable patterns that carry argumentative weight. If you are working with narrative, analyze plot structure, rising action, climax, resolution, point of view, whose perspective dominates, characterization. How are characters developed? Setting. How does geography function symbolically? Narrative gaps and silences. What is conspicuously not said? Exegesis, from the Greek exegema, to lead out in, is the careful, systematic process of drawing out the meaning of a text from the text itself. It is the opposite of eisegesis, which is reading your own meaning into the text. In a whole book analysis, you cannot exegete every verse. You will select key passages that are structurally central, theologically decisive, or most relevant to your guiding research question, and you will exegete those passages with depth. Here is the exegetical method I recommend. Step 1. Translation and textual criticism. Begin by reading the passage in the original language, or working with a good interlinear and multiple translations. Note significant translation decisions. Then perform basic textual criticism. Are there notable textual variants in this passage? Does the manuscript tradition show significant divergence? What do the critical apparatus notes in your NA28 or BHS indicate? You do not need to solve every textual problem, but you should demonstrate awareness of the manuscript tradition. Step 2. Grammatical and syntactical analysis. Examine the sentence-level grammar. What is the main verb? What is its tense, mood, and aspect? What is the relationship between clauses? Coordinate, subordinate, causal, conditional? Are there significant uses of the article, prepositions, or particles? For Hebrew, pay attention to the verb system. Gatal, yiktol, wa consecutive constructions carry a spectual meaning that English tenses do not always capture. For Greek, the aorist versus present versus perfect distinction often carries theological weight. In John 19:30, Jesus says, "Teteleste," perfect tense, it is accomplished, it stands accomplished. That perfect matters. Step 3. Word studies. Select key terms in the passage and study them. What is the semantic range of this word? How is it used elsewhere in this book? In this author's other writings, in the broader biblical corpus, are there important cognates or background uses in extra-biblical literature? Use your lexicons carefully. BDAG for Greek, halot for Hebrew. Be aware of the word study fallacy. The meaning of a word is determined by its usage in context, not by its etymology. Do not build entire theological arguments on root meanings. Step 4. Contextual analysis. Immediate, literary, and canonical. Situate the passage within 3 expanding circles of context. 1. Immediate context. The verses before and after 2. Literary context. The section, chapter, and book in which it appears 3. Canonical context. How the passage relates to the rest of Scripture, including New Testament development of Old Testament themes. Beware of proof texting, treating a verse as if it exists in isolation. Every passage derives a portion of its meaning from its location in the larger text. Step 5. Intertextual analysis. Does this passage, quote, allude to or echo another text? Biblical authors are in constant conversation with earlier Scripture. Isaiah quotes from the Psalms. Paul quotes Isaiah. The book of Revelation is built almost entirely of Old Testament allusions without a single formal quotation. Identifying these intertextual connections and asking what the author is doing with the source text is often the richest level of exegetical analysis. Step 6. Synthesizing the exegetical argument. After working through all these dimensions, synthesize. What does this passage mean? What is the author communicating to the original audience? What exegetical decisions did you make and why? Your exegetical analysis of individual passages must now rise to the level of theological synthesis. This is where you ask, what is this book saying about God, humanity, salvation, covenant, justice, creation, the end of history? Begin by identifying the major theological themes of the book. Most books have 2 or 3 dominant theological preoccupations. Slide examples of major themes by book. Romans, righteousness of God, justification by faith, the Jew/Gentile question, eschatological hope. Deuteronomy, covenant faithfulness, the danger of apostasy, the love of God, the blessing and curse structure. Job, the limits of retributive theology, theodicy, the nature of genuine faith under suffering. Revelation, the lordship of Christ over imperial power, the vindication of the martyrs, eschatological hope, Once identified, trace how each theme develops through the book. This is theological motif analysis, tracking a concept from its introduction through its development to its resolution. Ask, how is this theme introduced? How does it develop or complicate as the book progresses? Is there a climax or resolution to this theme within the book? How does this theme relate to the book's central theological purpose? Distinguish between descriptive and normative claims. Biblical narrative describes many things: violence, deception, polygamy, without prescribing them. Your theological analysis must be careful about the difference between what a text describes and what it commends. Engage the tension and complexity. The best theological analysis does not flatten the text into easy conclusions. It sits with the tensions, the God who commands genocide in Joshua alongside the God who commands love of neighbor in Leviticus, the Paul who says, "There is neither slave nor free" in Galatians, and yet addresses masters and slaves in Ephesians. Good scholarship names the tension and engages it honestly. Your analysis does not exist in a vacuum. It enters a conversation that has been going on for centuries, in some cases, millennia. A strong biblical analysis demonstrates awareness of the interpretive tradition. This means 1. Major interpretive schools and methods. Slide, schools of interpretation. Historical critical method, focused on reconstructing the historical background and compositional history of the text. Source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, tradition history. Literary narrative criticism, focused on the final form of the text as a literary whole. Canonical criticism, focused on how a book functions within the whole biblical canon. Brevard Childs. Social scientific criticism, reading the text through sociological and anthropological lenses. Reader response criticism, focused on how meaning is constructed in the act of reading. Liberation, feminist, post-colonial hermeneutics, reading from the margins, attending to power dynamics. You do not need to apply every method. You need to know they exist, understand how they produce different readings, and be transparent about which method shape your analysis. 2. Historical reception. How has this book been interpreted through church history? What did the fathers say? How did the reformers read it? Are there famous misreadings or contested interpretations that your analysis should address? For example, the history of interpretation of Romans 9-11 is a case study in theological controversy, predestination, double predestination, corporate election, the future of Israel. You cannot write a serious analysis of those chapters without acknowledging that battlefield. 3. Contemporary scholarly debate. What are the live debates in current scholarship about this book? Demonstrate that you are current with the literature and that your analysis engages the conversation rather than ignoring it. Now we come to the writing itself. You have done your research. You have your notes, your exegetical observations, your theological synthesis. Now you must organize it into a coherent, well-argued academic paper. The standard structure of a biblical book analysis 1. Introduction, 10% of total length. A compelling opening that establishes the significance of this book. Your guiding research question or thesis statement. A brief overview of your methodology. A roadmap of the paper's structure. Your thesis statement is the single most important sentence you will write. It makes a specific, arguable, substantiated claim about the book. For example, this analysis argues that Paul's use of the Abraham narrative in Galatians 3-4 functions not primarily as historical proof texting, but as a typological reconfiguration of Israel's covenant story in which Gentile inclusion becomes the eschatological fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. That is a thesis. This paper analyzes the book of Galatians is not a thesis. 2. Historical background and context, 15%. authorship, dating, provenance, historical occasion and setting, original audience and purpose. 3. Literary and structural analysis, 15%. Genre identification, macro structure of the book, key literary features and rhetorical strategy. 4. Exegetical analysis, 35 to 40%. This is the core of your paper. Work through your key passages systematically, applying the exegetical method we described. Each passage analysis should identify the passage's location and function in the book, analyze its grammar, vocabulary, and syntax, situate it in its literary and canonical context, identify intertextual connections, draw exegetical conclusions. 5. Theological synthesis, 15%. Major theological themes and how they develop. The book's central theological contribution. How this book's theology relates to broader biblical theology. 6. Interpretive engagement, 5 to 10%. Engage with major scholarly positions. Address significant interpretive debates. Situate your analysis within the scholarly conversation. 7. Conclusion, 5%. Restate your thesis in light of the analysis. Summarize the key findings. Identify areas for further study, writing style, and tone. Academic biblical scholarship has its own register. Here are the core principles. Slide, academic writing principles. Be precise. Vague language is the enemy of good exegesis. Do not say Paul talks about faith a lot. Say Paul employs pistis 11 times in Galatians, using it to denote both the act of trusting and the content of the gospel itself. Be argumentative. You are not just describing. You are arguing. Every paragraph should advance your thesis. Cite as you go. Every claim you make that is not your own original observation requires a citation. Every time you engage with a scholar's interpretation, name them. Use the present tense for textual analysis. Paul argues, not Paul argued. The text exists in the present of reading. Avoid homiletical language. You are writing scholarship, not a sermon. Do not say, this passage challenges us to, unless you are discussing the text's rhetorical address to its original audience. Use inclusive, precise language for historical communities, Paul's audience, the Corinthian community, not we or us. Biblical studies in most seminaries and universities follows SBL style, the SBL Handbook of Style, 2nd edition. This is your citation Bible. Know it. Key SBL conventions. Use footnotes, not in-text parenthetical citations, for secondary source citation. Biblical references follow standard format. Genesis 1:1, Matthew 5:3-10, 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. Always cite the commentary series, volume, and page number, not just the author. When citing ancient sources, Josephus, Philo, the Mishnah, Church Fathers, follow SBL conventions for ancient texts. A note on academic integrity. Using someone else's ideas without attribution is plagiarism. This is true even if you paraphrase. If you learned an argument from a scholar, cite them. The academic community is built on trust and attribution. Violating it has serious consequences. Also, AI-generated text substituting for your own research and analysis constitutes academic dishonesty in most institutional contexts. Your original thinking, your engagement with the text, your exegetical argumentation, these cannot be outsourced. The tools may assist with research access, but the analysis must be yours. Let me close with the most common mistakes I see in biblical book analyses and how to correct them. Mistake 1, summarizing. Instead of analyzing the problem, the paper retells what happens in the book without making arguments about it. The fix, ask so what after every paragraph. Every observation should lead to an interpretive or theological claim. Mistake 2, proof texting and verse isolation. The problem, verses are cited as isolated proof points, stripped of context. The fix, always situate your passage in its immediate literary and canonical context. Mistake 3, overdependence on one commentary. The problem, the paper essentially paraphrases a single commentary rather than engaging multiple scholarly perspectives. The fix, use 3 or more commentaries and a range of journal articles. Let them argue with each other. Mistake 4, anachronism. The problem, the author reads modern categories and questions into ancient texts. The fix, constantly ask, what would this have meant to the original audience? The text's original meaning is your first interpretive responsibility. Mistake 5, ignoring the original languages. The problem, the analysis never engages Hebrew or Greek, missing key nuances. The fix, even if you are not fluent, use your lexicons, engage key terms in the original language, show that you have looked beneath the translation. Mistake 6, a thesis that is merely descriptive. The problem, this paper analyzes the theology of hope in Romans. That is a topic, not a thesis. The fix, make a specific arguable claim. Paul's theology of hope in Romans 5 and 8 is grounded not in present circumstances, but in the resurrection of Christ as the first fruits of new creation, thereby reframing suffering as the necessary path of co-resurrection rather than evidence of divine absence. Mistake 7, no engagement with scholarly debate. The problem, the paper proceeds as if there is only one interpretation and no one has ever disagreed. The fix, engage at least 2 or 3 significant scholarly positions on your topic, even if you ultimately disagree with them. Let me close with a word about the purpose of all this work. Writing a rigorous analysis of a Bible book is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of intellectual and textual respect, taking the text seriously enough to ask hard questions, to sit with difficulty, to refuse easy answers, to bring every tool of scholarship to bear in the pursuit of understanding. The best biblical scholars are not those who have the most clever arguments. They are those who are most attentive to the text itself, who let the text speak on its own terms, in its own historical moment, in its own literary idiom, before they begin to systematize or apply. That posture of attentiveness is what your analysis should embody. Your work in this paper is a participation in a long conversation with the ancient authors, with the communities that preserved these texts, with generations of interpreters who struggled with the same questions, and with the living community of scholars who continue that struggle today. Do it with rigor. Do it with humility. Do it with curiosity. The text rewards the patient reader. 1. Define your scope and write your guiding research question. 2. Gather primary sources and secondary literature. 3. Investigate historical critical context. 4. Perform literary and structural analysis. 5. Conduct exegetical analysis of key passages. 6. Synthesize theological themes and motifs. 7. Engage the history of interpretation. 8. Structure and write your analysis. 9. Document properly using SBL style. 10. Revise with the Common Mistakes Checklist. Thank you for watching. Hi, this is Mike Koplitz from Followers of the Way Ministry. I hope you enjoyed this video. There is a tremendous amount of other material on the Followers of the Way website. You can find all kinds of no-cost material, research papers, videos, church graphics, educational videos. I hope you take an opportunity to come visit. God bless. Amen.